Hi, welcome to this conversation that we're having about animism and especially in relationship with the plants. My name is Rachel Weitz and my people are from Ireland and the Jewish diaspora, most recently Eastern Europe, and I live in Colorado on traditional lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne people. I have a healing arts practice here in which I partner with the more than human beings on other people's behalf for healing and divination. And I also teach people how to deepen those relationships with the more than human world for themselves. And one of my specialties is working with the plant kin. You can read more about my work at livingtruenature.com. And I'm here today with Dr. Daniel Foor, who is a licensed psychotherapist and a doctor of psychology. He has led ancestral and family healing intensives throughout the United States since 2005. He is an initiate of the Ifa or Orisha tradition of Yoruba-speaking West Africa and is trained with teachers of Mahayana Buddhism, Islamic Sufism, and different indigenous paths, including the older ways of his European ancestors. He is the author of Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing, and he lives with his family near Asheville, North Carolina. And for more information about him, you can see his website at ancestralmedicine.org. So I'm really happy to be here with you today, Daniel. We know each other because I have been one of your students in the ancestral practitioner work, and it's been wonderful and life-changing for me in that work, and I just really believe in it, and it's been great to work together, and happy to be here now.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm glad to be here too. Yeah.
Great. So let's start this conversation just giving a frame around animism and what that is.
Yeah, for sure. So animism is the way that I prefer to describe, and it's not an original term for me, but it has felt to me like the most accurate way to describe a set of core values that says living human beings are just one kind of person in a much wider field of relationships. Some of those others are visible to us, like mountains, mugwort, tigers. Some of them are not visible, like the ancestors, arguably deities, or other kinds of weird spirits. And most of those other kinds of people could care less about us. Some of them are well disposed toward us. Some of them are at odds with where we might be headed. And so living human beings are just one kind of person in a much wider community of people, human and other than human. That way of talking about it comes to me through Graham Harvey and his excellent scholarship. And he's in turn indebted to earlier scholars, Irving Hollowell and different indigenous folks whose way of talking and thinking and describing things has been influential for European lineages and academics who initially started out in a more sort of racist and patronizing vein, but have since gotten with the program a bit. And for me, that way of talking about it, of animism, it emphasizes core values more so than methodology, in a way that distances usefully from some of the misunderstandings that can arise by describing the work of shamanism or shamanic. You know, I don't have a big judgment about that. Some people have a lot of judgment about it. And some people I love dearly still favor that language. And so for me, I'm just seeking to be in the most accurate way of describing the work. And so, yeah, that's how I approach it. And so the intent as a good animist is to learn how to relate respectfully and skillfully with a much wider field of beings, and which communities of other beings any given person is drawn to relate with will depend on any given person's unique destiny or calling or affinities. So life is way too brief to specialize in all the things. But myself, I suppose I'm a bit of a generalist, or arguably a specialist in relating with the ancestors at this point, with the human dead, so to speak. But I also, sadly, in a way, I mean, beautifully and sadly, my calling to work with the ancestors has overshadowed or eclipsed in some ways my decades of ritual with the other than humans, with the land, with the animals, the plants, the spirits of place, and all that. So I'm excited to actually be returning gradually to that focus with some public teaching and other kinds of ritual.
Great.
Yeah.
So in that context, bringing it to the plants more specifically today, how do you see the plants fitting into this worldview? And then more specifically with the ancestors, how do you think that our ancestors were relating to the plants?
Well, yeah, those are two very big questions to unpackage over a number of days. But to the first, one thing that's exciting to me about relating with the plants is to break down our assumptions, cultural assumptions, English-based assumptions that can creep in and condition how we perceive the plants, and as a very specific, almost homogeneous group. And one example is that I'm less interested personally in how to get even more skillful ingesting the bodies of plants to treat human ailments, physical, spiritual, whatever. That's a very sacred and in many ways minor but sacred facet of human-plant relationships. And to back up even further, so I guess what I would say is I'm interested in friendship primarily with the plants, and to dispel the idea that there are plant people. I mean, sure, there absolutely are people who are called to give ritual focus or just relational focus to the plants. So in that sense, there are people who are called by or drawn to tend those relational pathways. And what I don't like about it is there are many, many people I meet who feel that because they don't have botanical knowledge, they haven't trained in specifically herbalism, that somehow the relationship, the enjoyment, the intimacy with the plants is blocked to them, or they're an outsider to it, because they tend to be negligent with their house plants or something like that. And so to dispel that, I'm saying that all of us can bring more conscious the profound daily indebtedness we have with the plants. And from that place, cultivate a spirit of gratitude, of friendship, and be recipient to the generosity and love and many diverse kinds of consciousness that they bring. The idea that there is, like if you ask me, tell me, Daniel, about humans, what do you think about humans? Like, what's their place in the story? That's a legit question, but it's kind of a big question. And the question about plants is that big as well, because there are so many different demographics of plant people. And so if we weighted them as people, as, I am guilty of it as well. I'll tend to think of my household as me, my wife, our daughter, and our 2 cats, not the Dracaena and the snake tongue plant and the other ficus and the other succulent behind me and the little cactus on the shelf. And, I know who the plants are in the house because I tend to them and I'm attentive to them. But I don't tend to think like, oh, we have about 15 people in our house, and then all the ones around the home. So the first important move to start to rekindle the so close to us available source of intimacy that are these relationships with the plants is to question some of our assumptions about how different they are. Animists in general tend to see that folks with different shaped bodies are still people. Like, they have culture just like we have culture. The similarities outweigh the differences. It's the shape of the body that varies. And so these differently bodied people who we speak of as plants are tremendously diverse and lovely to just come back into conscious relationship with. That, I think, I'll complete there for the moment, is the goal, if you will, a starting goal, is to just bring more conscious the relationships with the plants we're already embedded in unconsciously. There's not a need to reach for a new relationship necessarily.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And so then taking that and also looking at it from an ancestral view as well, what is your sense from the experiences that you've had, maybe with your ancestors directly or other people that you've been facilitating in this work? How do you see that ancestral relationship with the plants?
Sure. So at the very least, there are ancestrally carved out pathways between our people. Let's speak for a moment just of ancestors of blood. Of course, there are ancestors of affinity as well, or spiritual lineage and whatnot. But our ancestors of blood, so everybody automatically has that set of inherited relationships with plants that are meaningful to humans because we eat them, we take shelter with them, we find medicine with them, and we perhaps engage them for ritual or ceremonial purposes. And I'm sure there are other intentions as well, but those are 4 as a starting point. And so my ancestors of blood have relationship with yarrow, let's say, as a European herb that I've dreamt of and that my ancestors have spoken of with me as a more medicinal plant. There are food crops that my people have been intimate with for a long time, and that's a whole nother discussion about the domesticated wild conversation and how plants get brought into the human sphere. And there are plants that are like the ash as one type of world tree, or the oak, who are maybe not eaten, of course, acorns, but they're plants that are ritually significant intergenerationally. And so the way I think of the ancestral component, one element of it, is that those plants are friends of my elders, my ancestor elders. And so when I go to greet their big spirits, it's like, oh yes, we know you're the grandson of so-and-so. Because the plant as a big consciousness tends to be a bit more hive or collective or group-minded than most humans. And so the ancestral memory is available to the individual organisms. It's my sense of it. And so it's like if you meet a family that knows your family, and they're like, oh yeah, you establish those common connection points. So there's a familiarity, an ancestral familiarity that can make stepping into those relationships even easier. But that can happen through tradition as well. In Yoruba tradition, we work with so many different ewe, fa, or just the leaves, the sacred leaves. And when I'm working with a formula or working with a specific prescription with the plants, I'm re-inhabiting an ancestral pathway. Now, granted, it's Yoruba ancestors, but as an initiate, you get like attuned to those things in your energy body, even though it's not a link that you inherited through blood. And the potency of the connection is amplified because the ancestral way of working with that plant is being reenacted. And so it's recreating and re-inhabiting the kind of etiquette and intimacy that was carved out by earlier generations. So when the ancestral protocols are remembered, that's especially nice. That, well, it's intimate, yeah. And we can just approach. As long as we're open to hearing no, we can always walk up and be like, hi, to the person at the party. They may or may not want to talk to us, but you can say hi, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love what you're saying about the creating the pathways or the cellular memories almost that can become activated through this connection. And it leaves me to wonder, I lived in Peru for a couple years, and when I lived there, I was working with people who were in an uninterrupted line of plant tradition, and so it was very much alive. Mm-hmm. And what I found when working with the plants, when I was introduced through the people who are of that tradition, that the plants would almost be they would be so available. They're so ready for that relationship because it's so it's never been broken. It's never been broken. And so I was so amazed because the plant would just come up and shake my hand, and say, hi, nice to meet you. Here I am.
Yeah.
And you find here living in the US, that sometimes it could be that more wild plants, it takes a little more effort. There seems like there might have been something that has been broken, or a mistrust maybe from experiences of colonization and
Yeah,
etc. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit
there's a
about.
great book by M. Anderson. I want to say Tending the Wild, but it's about native California plant ecologies. And I think there may be some controversy about the author not giving enough credit to native sources. But in any case, there are gems in the book. It's a bit of a dense read. But one of the things that stood out to me in reading it was she was interviewing, I believe, Karuk or Yuruk, a Northern California California native person, about their perception of the change of the plant ecologies since the arrival of Europeans and Spanish and all the genocidal badness that's indicative of the histories. And what the elder said is, it was surprising. And she said something like, yeah, since all the disruptions, things have reverted back to a wild state. It's terrible. And I share that to unpackage it here for a moment, that sometimes we can have an unsophisticated view that humans are in opposition or not belonging in the rest of the other than human world, the so-called natural world. And this elder is saying, oh no, the human way of tending with the rest of life, at least in that area, included, and this is very well documented, things like prescribed burns, relating with the whole landscape as a living garden. And so tinkering, but within certain bounds of feedback and ancestral knowledge and lore and listening. And so the land was more biologically diverse before the waves of disease and killing and things that the Europeans brought. And so when there were less indigenous stewards of the land, the biological diversity dipped, and the land went back to a not relating with humans as much state. And there is another perspective shared in the book that, or I think it's from, I want to say Essie Parrish, but not sure. I don't think it's actually her. Sorry, it's Sierra Miwok Elder. The name is escaping me, as a basket maker. But the perspective is that if you're not working ritually with the plants, that they lose their medicine. That there's a way that relating with them keeps things alive. It keeps some part of their attention entrained a bit on the human world. And I see this with spirit, other than plant spirits, like mountain spirits of land, spirits of place, in areas where humans haven't been tending to the relationships. Those beings are like, why are you talking to me? Like, what? Like, who are you? Like, what? Like, there's not a habit of humans and those ones speaking. And so the relationships, either they haven't been cultivated for a long time, or perhaps they haven't been cultivated at all. Just because the Americas have been inhabited for 10, 20 plus thousand years doesn't mean that every single place on the continent was actively ritually worked with. And so some places have actually not been approached, or been approached very little. And so the plants, generally speaking, in my experience, enjoy being in relationship, provided there's etiquette and love and consideration and reciprocity. And so the idea that we are antithetical or foreign to the rest of life is it's an intellectual concretizing of shame about how much harm has been caused. It's not actually helpful. It's a block to relationship. It's like when you're in a relationship with someone and you're like, oh, I love you. They're like, I don't deserve love. Why do you love me? And you're like, oh, geez, really? I'm sorry. Like, I can say why, but it's not really why. I just do. And so the plants are, in my experience, very generous by temperament, provided we come with manners. So when there's an intergenerational habit of really adoring them and valuing them and seeing that just their very presence, aside from their physical bodies, their very sentience and personalities are medicine and are healing, wise, intelligent, creative community members. And when we see them in that way, then sure, they're more used to us. It's not that different from animals. Animals who are hunted by humans will run away when there's humans. If humans aren't in a habit of hunting them, they'll probably be quicker to approach. Yeah.
Yeah. Great, thanks. So how do you see, like, if there is a general disconnection that maybe happened that might be in connection with colonization or not, you can kind of speak to that if you want to, but with people coming to the United States and maybe losing connection with their ancestral plants, or also bringing some of their ancestral plants with them here, maybe talking about the coevolution of, like, was there a disconnection in general? Was there a cultural wound that happened that created that disconnection? And then I guess there's a second question about native plants and non-native plants. Follow up there.
There's a lot that could be said, but of course, those who came to the Americas more or less consensually, on the whole, had lost a great deal of their etiquette for relating with the other than humans already.
Yeah.
And it requires a breakdown in manners and cultural wellness to think that you can invade and occupy another's land. Those who came non-consensually through the slave trade to the Americas, generally speaking, brought a greater cultural awareness of the sacredness of plants and etiquette, generalizing here, but traditional African cultures, some of whom were already Christian or Muslim, but many of whom were still practicing more traditional animistic understandings, either on their own terms or alongside the introduction of Christianity and Islam to West Africa. Those arrivals, in general, I would say probably were arriving with more etiquette around the plants. However, the conditions are completely fucking awful. And so who the plants are radically different. And, all the same, if you take a tradition like Yoruba traditions in Brazil or in Cuba or in the diaspora, the same sensibilities around the plants were brought here and survived, albeit through, adaptation under really difficult circumstances. And the other plants were substituted for similar ritual processes. And much of the basic animistic etiquette is still there. And so the disconnection from land in general, whether people are moving consensually or non-consensually, can't be overstated. It's a really very impactful kind of thing for not all, but most people when that change happens. And rarely did the settlers or enslaved peoples have the opportunity to understand the prior etiquette and relationships that diverse native nations and peoples already had in place for relating with the plants. And so there's a great deal of intergenerational understanding and relationships with the plants for the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different native peoples throughout the Americas, that some of which has survived, some of which has been completely lost, some of which is still intact piecemeal. As for the good news, to kind of soften that, I know it's maybe perhaps a heavy angle on it, but the plants can be approached. We can just ask them, like, hey, can we talk? Can we start to come back into relationship? And often if we come with kindness and maybe an offering and humility, I find that they're quite open to that. About the distinction between native and non-native plants is another big conversation, but ecologically, I, like many people, value biological diversity. And in that sense, a non-native plant that also has an invasive or really dominant personality because of the ecological conditions or because of just the adaptiveness of that plant to its new environment, it can decrease the biological diversity in an area. And in that sense, that's undesirable. It's like good to act in ways that allow the maximum amount of different community members to be there as one generalized indicator for ecological health, right? So there is something to be said for that. And also the idea that this of non-nativeness and foreignness or alien plants or invasive plants can really quickly kind of dovetail into this weird xenophobic, racist, standoffish language that humans have with each other, and an idea that indigenous ecologies are somehow static or that these things don't happen on their own terms. Now, like that ecological change doesn't already happen. So I think that it's good to work with what's already happening. And Peter Michael Bauer is one person in rewilding, a founder, as I understand it, of rewilding type things in Portland, who's has some real brilliant teachings on this, and others in the plant communities that I'm less tapped into. But I would say to folks who have a bad feeling toward non-native plants that it's good to soften that paradigm a bit and to love them and to make sure that you're not replicating a purity-minded view that has sneaky kind of roots in colonialist thinking or even white supremacy. I mean, it's a bit of a jump in a way, but that same mindset that leads to like judging people's racial identity based on blood quanta can start to influence how we view plants and which plants are valuable and all that. And I think there's more heart needed and more messiness in all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really seems like that is the best way to actually communicate with the plants, is from the heart-centered place. So that makes a lot of sense.
And from listening first. If you don't want to be the Christopher Columbus of herbalism, you're just like, let me come like human-splain to you plants why some of you shouldn't be living here.
Yeah.
Then just like shut your human face and listen a little first. It's going to go better. So,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah. So it seems like there can be this connection, like you were talking about yarrow being an ancestral plant, for example. There can be a beautiful connection to working with an ancestral plant that is from the lands your people are from. And also there's something about just the spirit of an animistic way of the land that you're on and just connecting with the plants where you're at, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. If you are only, like I was going to try to not go here, now I'm going to go here. There's a thing that has happened at times, and it's just one element in the American left or social justice movement at times. I believe it's a minor element that's very purity seeking, feels very Protestant to me. No disrespect to Protestants, like unhelpfully Protestant is how I mean it in this context. And reinforcing unconsciously of the category of different races in a way that fails to dismantle that framework. And what I mean by that is the view is basically you need to practice the traditions of your ancestors. It's the only legitimate thing to do. If you're doing something other than what your blood allows you to do, you're a racist, colonizer, white supremacist, replicator of patriarchy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, whoa, so go slow. We need more nuance than that. Mm-hmm. If you are going to speak for the plants themselves, like I've been in the Matilaha wilderness, I've met Salvia apiana, I have like communed lovingly with white sage. and gathered little crumbled leaves from the sage plants and seen them in bloom and greeted the rattlesnakes near them. And if someone were to magically appear over my shoulder and to say, you are a colonizer if you pick up those leaves and burn them, you are harming native peoples, it is unethical to work with white sage because you are a white man. I'm like, something about it feels like it lacks nuance. Now, I'm not saying that there are no legitimate issues here around cultural mindfulness. I think it's excellent to ask our own ancestors, what practices have we inherited that can be drawn on beautifully and re-enlivened to, to ritually get good results, and to be very mindful about cultural sensitivity and impact and all that. And if you have a choice between importing a European kind of juniper or working, let's say, with Eastern red cedar, another one in the cypress family here in North Carolina, what's more ethical? To use the petroleum to fly the plant over from Europe and to enact cultural purity in that way, or to respectfully greet an abundant local cypress relative of a European cedar or juniper and work with that locally? I don't think it's so black and white. So yes, working locally with mindfulness, with respect to the ecological limits of a thing. Now, if people are saying white sage is being over-harvested, absolutely. That's very different than growing white sage near to you, or, so there are different considerations. So we want to be mindful to not over-harvest the plants as well. But I think it's important to not impose too much of our cultural rigidity onto our heart-aware relationships with the plant people, and to let them speak. If our way of approaching it has so much righteousness in it that there's no space for the voices of the plants themselves, we're missing the framework. Yeah. Let's talk. I know we were planning to talk about things like ayahuasca, right? Or things that, do you want to ask? Why don't we talk about that? Let me know what would be helpful on it.
Well, I was actually thinking while you were speaking just then about letting the plants talk. I felt called to ask you, do you have a specific experience of a plant directly communicating about some of this with you? Or maybe it's about like the whole long view of the plants. I know sometimes I've connected with plants and they've kind of showed me this bigger pulling out perspective of how plants were here before the humans, and that humans wouldn't be alive without the plants. And then this co-evolution, like you said, plants are very relational. So it really is a co-experience. And I'm wondering if you have any experiences from messages from plants specifically, maybe, that you want to share.
There's so much, in a sense. And in some ways, my ritual focus hasn't been as with them, but my angle, and everyone has their own style, but my angle is more friendship with them. And mysticism, it can be a pretentious word, but like, I'm interested in their wisdom, and they strike me, to generalize here, as kind and balanced and steady and loving and uninterested in pretense, and able to cut through a lot of the static and anxiety and cultural damage that we tend to take on with being very thinky mammals. And the community teachings that they embody seem very foreground. Like, so they bring good medicine for isolation and lack of love. So they're very loving and generous. To generalize, of course, so many plants have their own personalities. I think, if I'm imagining like a party scenario, and you're talking to someone, you have a great conversation with them, and then you go to, it's time to go. It's cold out, it's winter, and you're each putting your jacket on. And, you notice that you put on a human suit, and the other one puts on like this prickly hawthorn tree suit. And it's like, oh, it's been good speaking to you. Okay, so back to, our daily existence. So the plants, that's what I would wish for people, is to be able to enjoy their company as we would another human kind of person. I mean, not to say that they need to assume human form, but that's the form we're familiar with. And so if you are to wonder what is this rhododendron like, because they're all over in Western North Carolina, and so you ask, is it possible to have an encounter with this one? One of many ways that encounter could unfold is to say, if rhododendron were to assume human form for my own convenience, because that's a form I'm most used to valuing and interfacing with, could we do it like that? On the flip side, I remember in trance work years ago, feeling there's a thing, it's a legitimate thing, and not to be dramatic about it, but shape-shifting or kind of assuming the forms of other things. And people are excited to do that if it's like a tiger or a hawk or something. But I remember having a feeling of shifting into the form of a tree, cedar tree. And my initial response, I was freaked out for like a couple seconds because I have any face or eyes and there's no directionality exactly. This is a very different 360, no face or all face consciousness. And so for us, it's also good practice if we want to go have dinner with that guest. Let's say we had a good meeting at the party. Now we want to go extend the conversation. Be like, oh, can I come to your, where you're at? Can I come to your house next time? So, okay, so I'm going to come dressed as Hawthorne. So you assume that form. So flexibility of form is one of the things that can be cultivated as an animist for the intention of politeness and knowing how to meet others on their own terms and to listen like a hawthorn and not only like a human, because human is not a superior form. Yeah. So that's what, for me, that's one of the things that plants are brilliant about, is helping us to flip perspective. It's not just them, but to think and move as a plant would is good. It's a good antidote for a lot of our ragged anxiety.
Yeah. And I wonder, coming into that, being able to go to the plant's home and have that perspective of the plant, I wonder what you think about the implications of people who maybe don't have those relationships because they weren't passed down to them and they're trying to explore it now. How do you see people starting to explore those relationships and receiving more plant perspective? What would be the impact on our current reality right now that we're dealing with? What's your sense anyway? I know it's...
Yeah, well, the place I encourage people to begin, I mean, the short answer is there'd be more love. And that's helpful. And for people who are all pickled in love, then the plants might be like, let me teach you about bark and thorns. So plants they're diverse. So they have lots of different kinds of magic. Or let me teach you about poison, for example. So they have lots of medicines. And I don't mean like physical medicines necessarily. I mean like teachings, wisdom teachings. And I encourage folks to start with the plants that are already around us. The food plants, for example. Pretty much everyone is eating the bodies of plants in some form or another. We're heterotrophs. We kill others and eat them. Some folks occasionally become righteous because they feel that plants are inferior to animals and that by not eating animals, they are morally better than others, which is an unfortunate position that objectifies and depersonifies the intelligent old wisdom of plants whose bodies we also eat. And so if we bring our attention to the sacredness of the plants we're eating, we're working with what's already present. This conversation is powered by plants. And beyond that, my mood would be really different. It's about 40 degrees here in Western North Carolina, if not for the tree bodies that make up the house that we're dwelling in, and the fibers that I'm wearing, and the companion plants that are shifting the atmosphere in the house and just holding down a lovely energy. And so we are surrounded by plants who we often undervalue. It's just similar with the animals. We could be like, I'm into shamanism. I'm going to connect with bears and tigers. I love bears and tigers too. And you might connect with cow because you just had a tasty hamburger, or connect with the mice living under your house or the crows in your neighborhood. To skip them is to be a little bit, what's the word? Like impolite, trendy, like kind of like the annoying popular kid at school who looks over the other people. It's like being snobby, I guess. Yeah. So it's good to not do that with the plants. Black bean and corn and sugar and rice have complicated, interesting stories. We are profoundly indebted to those in the Poaceae family, the grasses, of so many sorts. And so getting to know grasses is a great, like if you haven't greeted the grasses, it's like you don't get permission to greet the rare blooming orchids yet. So, I mean, it's a little dramatic, but if somebody's asking my opinion, you get the point with the etiquette. Yeah. Start with what's close. They're already in relationship with us. They're the guest at the table who, you know, we're standing on their foot. We don't even realize they're there. So the etiquette is to look who are we already in relationship with.
Yeah. So say somebody was connecting with, you know, the greens that they ate for lunch that day, the kale. How would do you have just some really doable ways that someone could come into that connection?
Gratitude is better than apology when we eat the bodies of others. If I choose to intervene and offer my life to prevent some kind of harm from happening, or, you know, I jump in front of a car and push somebody out of the way and then I die, whatever. I don't want the person to feel sorry about it. I would want them to be like, hey, thanks. That was super helpful. I'm sorry you died, I suppose, but like, thanks. And I see this contraction around receiving a gift. It happens especially with eating the bodies of animals, because we identify more easily and empathically with others who have eyes and move fast like us. We think they're more legit as beings than plants typically, because, you know, a field full of corn doesn't seem as sentient as a pig. And it feels different emotionally. I've been present when a pig is killed and I've plucked corn off the stalk, and there's a different emotional tenor to the two. And do I think pig is more legit than corn? No, I don't. When I zoom out from it, it's more familiar to me, so I value it more. So I think one place to start is noticing what's already happening and giving thanks for those relationships, and pausing to to do a little research even. So let's say you have some kale and you look into the history of kale. You're like, oh, this is a brassica. I believe that's true for the kale. And the brassicas, I believe, were domesticated in the southern Mediterranean and Italy and other places, and especially got popularized in Roman Empire, but probably before that. And so what are the wild roots of the brassicas? And what are so you actually learn about the plant is one way to get to know them. And ask. When I guided, some years ago, I guided a year-long ritual working with the plant people. And I asked all the participants to really get to know one common food plant, and to ask that plant for a basic ritual of honoring that person could then in turn share with the group, that people could do to honor, rice or pepper, whoever it is. So study the history of the plant and ask that one, what would that plant like from us by way of gratitude? So rather than say you should do X practice, the practice would be listen from the heart to that plant and see what that one provides us with for a means to deepen the relationship. But the spirit of gratitude is almost always a win. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
So thinking about the plants that are around us all the time, some people don't necessarily spend a lot of time in the wild or are farmers or gardeners, but a lot of people do have houseplants. And I'm wondering how, just your opinion about the common houseplants that we have and our relationship to them.
Yeah, I would invite a softening or a deconstructing of some of the ways that how we frame it affects our relationship. Like I spoke to it earlier a bit, but for example, if somebody gifts me a plant, it's kind of a big deal. Often my first feeling is one of annoyance, because I'm like, oh geez, like I wouldn't gift someone a puppy without talking to them. Or like, I brought you a human child. I'd be like, where did you get it? You can't do that. And so, but people will be like, I got you an orchid. I'm like, wow, love you, but do you know how fussy orchids are? And so I feel guilt when I kill plants in my care. And so one is to, not in a pressure on ourselves way, but to see them as members of our household, beings that are part of our trust and our care, and to see the so-called ornamentals, or often other than local plants that are part of the landscaping or whatever it is in our area, to understand and appreciate them. We tend to, we have often, I see this in so-called spiritual circles as well, to have a hierarchy of value among the plants. Okay, like wild ginger in Western North Carolina, oh my God, it's a spiritual herb and a rare plant. Rhododendron, okay, awesome, but more common. Local ornamental plants, or what, hydrangea, or whoever it is, you're like, not so interesting. It's a ornamental or non-native. And then a ficus in the house that somebody bought at Lowe's department store, and to see that as very lower on the valuing, right? And I'm saying it's really problematic. We wouldn't have that same etiquette with, like, if I said, oh, I have some house humans, you'd be like, that sounds really off, and reminds us of bad times in history. And so I'm not saying it's the same with houseplants. I'm not equating like slavery with houseplants, but I'm saying the objectification that we bring to the companion plants is one way to speak of them, maybe, in our environment, that we intentionally bring in, can run at cross purposes to enjoying the intimacy with the weird, old, complicated souls that they are. And so one way to shake that up is to just speak to them as friends. Be like, hey, good to see you. You looking good. You have what you need. I'm listening. Take a sec just to listen, just to have a moment. Be like, you're looking damn good with those flowers. Like, hi, good to see you. I notice you. Like, you're the only plant in this room. You've been hanging out in this bathroom for 1.5 years, and now you're blooming. Hi, good to see you. And actually just notice them. That is a baseline of etiquette, is to appreciate their completeness as a being, and that you've brought them into your sphere. And if you're going to do that, you've made a karmic link with them and all the others of their community.
Yeah.
So if we hold it in a sacred way, then we get to enjoy the benefits of that kind of life. Yeah.
As you're speaking, I'm noticing your house plant, your your friend behind you, and
Uh-huh.
I don't know if I'm just sort of like projecting this, but there's this sense that the houseplant is like, yes.
Right. No, I understand. I was speaking in an interview the other day about the microbiology and the very smalls, and I had to shift the topic because I was starting to get in a trancy state. So because I could feel a little bit the millions of organisms who are also this body. And when we shift our attention, it's like there's a whole nother conversation happening on another channel than where we're at. And that's one of the cool things about human form is we have a flexibility of consciousness. We're able to vibe with different kinds of forms. I don't know that it's unique to humans, but humans it seems like one of our superpowers. And so, yeah, another way of saying it is to not presume that we know the depth of the experience of this plant behind me. I don't know this plant's genus or species necessarily. And to be transparent, I purchased this plant at the hardware store, but I sat, I kind of tuned in. I'm like, which one of these wants to come into my home? And I am attentive, despite the stresses of parenting, to make sure the plants are well watered, they have a little bit of extra nutrient. And so I appreciate them. And when they're dry or I've forgotten about them, I'm like, oh, sorry. And that basic tending is good for us as well. Like if I go into somebody's spiritual space and their plants are dry, it's like it pains me. I'll go water other people's plants. I feel like it's rude a little bit. It's like parenting other people's kids, but I'm like, you can't do meaningful work in this room. Your plants are thirsty.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Totally. Great. So is there anything else that you feel important that we may have missed or that's sticking out to you that we should name here?
Yeah, there's so much, but we touch on this in the Animism course that I guide. And so if folks want to deepen, they could do that. But the main thing I want to convey is the plants are profoundly available for relationship in a more conscious way. They can be a source of deep and sustained relational intimacy and an antidote in that way to the loneliness a lot of people sit with, and a source of real friendship, not just beings that can listen to what's happening to us, but who can respond. And so they are a source of intimate, meaningful, complex relationship. So that's one thing. And that if you haven't been raised in a framework that encourages those relationships, that's okay. It means that you have experienced cultural damage or disconnection, likely from legacies of colonialism or different kinds of trouble. And that's in a way, it's another conversation of how did it get messed up. But the important thing is that we can just return to relationship and just start with acknowledging what's already happening and the beings that are already being ingested by us to power our day. And that seems like a basic, small kind of thing, but it's actually really healing and corrective for the pace and the attitude that is so prevalent in modern culture. So and the last thing I guess that comes to mind is don't pity the plants that are being related with poorly. Like if you go to a slaughterhouse or you go to a monocropped field of wheat and you see that something about it feels off in your soul, indeed, it's not a good way to live. And love those ones. And if you're not able to love them and see yourself in them, then at least don't project your own pity onto them. Beings don't want our pity. So don't bring that to the plants. It's not helpful, especially since many of them are the ones that we enjoy eating. And if you do something like eat a piece of candy and you're enjoying some highly processed corn, well, you can still say thanks to the corn and still appreciate the old roots of the wisdom keepers who first domesticated corn. So they're available, and it's good for our heart, and it's good for our culture to come back into communion with them. Yeah. So I'll say that, and thank you, Rachel, for the time, and just want to appreciate your practice and what you're holding down there in Boulder, and teaching you're doing with the plants and with the land and the ancestors. So thanks for everything you're doing for the people, human and otherwise. Yeah.
Great. Does this feel like a good place to end?
Yeah, I think so. And just a reminder, if folks want to check out what I'm up to, it's ancestralmedicine.org. And you might as well say your website again, Rachel, if you would.
Sure, that's livingtruenature.com.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Daniel.